There is a phrase buried inside a recent Canadian trade announcement that almost no outlet bothered to fully unpack. And once you understand what it actually requires, the entire story changes shape. The phrase is, "Build where you sell." 4 words, presented as a minor technical condition attached to a quota for Chinese electric vehicles. Most coverage treated it as a footnote to the real headline. Canada agreed to let 49,000 Chinese-made electric vehicles enter the country at a sharply reduced tariff rate of 6.1%, down from the 100% tariff Canada had imposed in 2024, in exchange for China lifting its retaliatory tariffs on Canadian canola and other agricultural products. That headline is accurate. It is also not the story. Because build where you sell is not a minor technical condition. It is a structural requirement that fundamentally changes what it means for China to access the Canadian market. And it sits alongside 2 other conditions that, taken together, represent one of the more sophisticated pieces of trade architecture Canada has constructed in recent memory. Over the next few minutes, I am going to show you exactly what those conditions require, why Japan's automotive giants are watching this unfold with quiet alarm, and why this entire negotiation is happening in the shadow of a CUSMA review that starts in just over a week. Here is what actually happened. Because the agricultural framing, while true, is the smallest part of this story. Industry Minister Minister Joly, conducting negotiations that culminated in conversations with executives from BYD, Chery, Geely, and Shanghai Launch, secured Chinese agreement to a quota structure that allows a limited number of Chinese electric vehicles into Canada this year at preferential tariff rates. In return, China agreed to remove the tariffs it had placed on Canadian canola and other agricultural exports, tariffs that had been hurting Canadian farmers since the broader trade tensions between the 2 countries escalated. On the surface, that is a clean trade for a clean trade. Market access for market access. But the Canadian government did not stop at negotiating a number. It attached 3 conditions to that number, and each one does something specific that a simple tariff reduction would not. The first condition is the one captured by that phrase, "Build where you sell." Chinese manufacturers seeking to expand beyond this initial quota cannot simply ship finished vehicles into Canada and sell them. They are required to establish manufacturing operations inside Canadian territory. This is not a request. It is a structural precondition for any quota expansion beyond the current allocation. Think about what that demand actually does to China's traditional export model. For the better part of 2 decades, the entire logic of Chinese manufacturing dominance has rested on producing at scale domestically, where labor costs, supply chain density, and government industrial policy create cost advantages that are extraordinarily difficult for other countries to match, and then exporting the finished product to markets around the world. Canada's condition inverts that logic specifically for its own market. If you want to sell more here, you have to build here. You cannot simply export your way into a larger share of the Canadian auto market. You have to plant a factory inside Canadian borders. The second condition compounds the first. Any manufacturing facility a Chinese company establishes in Canada under this framework must be majority owned by Canadian partners. This is not a joint venture where China retains controlling interest and Canada provides a junior local partner for political cover. The ownership structure has to tilt toward Canadian control. That detail matters enormously because it determines who actually captures the long-term value of any facility built under this arrangement. A factory with Chinese technology and Chinese capital, but majority Canadian ownership, produces a fundamentally different distribution of profit, governance authority, and strategic control than a wholly Chinese-owned subsidiary operating on Canadian soil. The third condition is the one that received the least public attention and may be the most consequential. Any Chinese manufacturer operating in this space must provide absolute cybersecurity guarantees that vehicle user data, the location information, driving patterns, biometric data, and connected device information that modern electric vehicles generate constantly will not be transferred to the Chinese state. This is not a generic privacy commitment. It is a specific response to a specific concern that Western governments have raised repeatedly about Chinese manufactured connected technology. That data generated by devices operating inside allied countries could become accessible to Chinese state security services through legal or technical mechanisms embedded in how Chinese companies are required to cooperate with their own government. Canada's condition is a direct firewall against that exact scenario, applied specifically to a category of consumer technology, the modern electric vehicle, that generates an extraordinary volume of sensitive location and behavioral data every single day it is driven. Now hold all three of these conditions together and look at what they construct. This is not a trade agreement in the traditional sense, where one country trades market access for market access and the goods simply flow across the border. This is an architecture that allows Chinese capital and Chinese manufacturing expertise into the Canadian market, while simultaneously ensuring that the long-term ownership, the physical production footprint, and the data infrastructure all remain anchored inside Canadian control. China gets access to a market it has wanted for years. Canada gets the jobs, the capital investment, the majority ownership stake, and an ironclad guarantee against the exact surveillance concern that has made Western governments wary of Chinese connected technology in the first place. That is a genuinely sophisticated piece of policy design, and it deserves to be understood as such rather than reduced to a simple headline about canola tariffs. But here is where the story gets more complicated, because this entire negotiation happened inside an existing industrial reality that the deal's architects could not simply wave away. Toyota and Honda, the two Japanese automotive giants, currently account for 75% of all vehicle manufacturing capacity inside Canada. That is not a minor market share. That is the overwhelming majority of an industry that employs roughly 500,000 Canadian workers, directly and indirectly. Any new entrant into that market, particularly one entering with state-supported pricing advantages and a government-negotiated path to expanded access, represents a direct competitive threat to the companies that have spent decades building Canada's automotive manufacturing base. And Toyota and Honda were not in the room when this deal was negotiated. Minister Joly's primary engagement with Japanese industry concerns happened separately, in a teleconference she held while on a trip to Japan, where she briefed Japanese officials and, by extension, the automotive companies whose investments are most exposed on the details of the China arrangement after the framework had already taken shape. That sequencing matters. The deal was built, and then the affected ally was briefed on it. Joly's public position has been that Japanese investment is not at risk, that the government's goal is to protect Canada's existing manufacturing capacity and its 500,000 automotive jobs, while also opening a new, carefully bounded channel for Chinese capital and technology. Whether Toyota and Honda's own strategic planning departments see it the same way is a separate question, and it is one that has not yet produced a public answer from either company. Think about the position Japan occupies in this picture. For decades, Japanese automotive investment has been treated as one of the most stable, reliable pillars of Canada's manufacturing economy. It does not generate headlines because it does not need to. It simply produces vehicles, employs workers, and anchors supply chains year after year, election cycle after election cycle, trade dispute after trade dispute. China's entry into the same market, with government-negotiated conditions that did not exist for Toyota or Honda when they first established their own Canadian operations decades ago, introduces a new variable into a relationship that Japan had reasonably assumed was settled and secure. And here is where the two threads of this story, the China deal and the Japan relationship, intersect with something larger that almost no coverage connected explicitly. This negotiation with China is unfolding 10 days before Canada enters its first formal CUSMA review session with the United States and Mexico. The United States, under the Trump administration, has been explicitly and aggressively hostile to Chinese electric vehicle access into North American markets, treating Chinese EV manufacturing capacity as a direct strategic threat to American and allied automotive industries. Canada negotiating a structured pathway for Chinese EVs into its own market, even one wrapped in ownership restrictions, manufacturing requirements, and data sovereignty guarantees, is happening at the exact moment Canada needs the goodwill and flexibility of the United States at the CUSMA negotiating table. That timing is either remarkably poor or remarkably deliberate. And the answer likely depends on how you read Carney's broader foreign policy doctrine. This is a government that has consistently described its approach as variable geometry, building relationships with multiple partners simultaneously rather than anchoring its entire strategic posture to a single dominant ally. Under that doctrine, the China deal is not a contradiction of Canada's relationship with Washington or Tokyo. It is a demonstration that Canada retains the latitude to negotiate independently with Beijing on its own terms that happen to be considerably more restrictive than what a simple market access deal would have produced, while still preserving its existing commitments to its other major automotive partners. But doctrine and diplomatic reality do not always align cleanly. Washington's negotiators sitting down for the CUSMA review will see a Canada that just opened a new channel, however conditional, for Chinese electric vehicles at precisely the moment the United States has been pushing its own trade partners to close exactly those channels. Whether that becomes a point of friction in the CUSMA talks or simply a footnote that both sides agree not to dwell on, will become clear only once those negotiations actually begin. The standard has changed here in a way worth naming directly. For most of the post-war trading era, market access decisions of this scale were negotiated primarily as tariff and quota arithmetic, numbers traded for numbers, market share traded for market share. What Canada has constructed with this China deal is something different. Access conditioned on structural concessions about where production happens, who owns it, and where the data it generates is allowed to travel. That is not simply a trade agreement. It is an attempt to extract the economic benefit of engaging with Chinese industrial capacity, the capital, the manufacturing expertise, the competitive pricing pressure that benefits Canadian consumers, while structurally insulating the parts of that engagement that Western governments have identified as genuine strategic risks. Whether that balance holds depends on details that have not yet been tested. Will Chinese manufacturers actually commit to majority Canadian ownership structures in order to expand beyond this initial quota? Or will the quota simply remain capped at its current modest level precisely because the ownership requirement makes further expansion commercially unattractive to Beijing? Will the data sovereignty guarantee survive the technical complexity of actually auditing where vehicle telemetry data flows once a car is on the road? And will Toyota and Honda's quiet unease translate into reduced future investment in Canada? Or will they simply absorb this new competitive pressure as the cost of operating in a market that has decided, however carefully, to open a second door? Watch 3 things in the weeks ahead. First, watch whether any Chinese manufacturer actually announces a concrete manufacturing investment under the Build Where You Sell framework, because that would convert this from a negotiated possibility into an operating reality. Second, watch what Toyota and Honda say, or do not say, in their next quarterly investment disclosures about Canadian operations. And third, watch how the CUSMA review treats this China arrangement when negotiators from Washington raise it, because the answer to that question will tell you whether Canada's variable geometry strategy can actually hold multiple major partners in balance at the same time, or whether eventually one relationship has to give ground to protect another. A quota is never just a number. It is a measurement of how open a door actually is. Canada just built a door with 3 separate locks on it, handed China one of the keys, and is now watching to see whether anyone else in the room objects to how it was built. If this story is telling you something you have not heard elsewhere, share it. Drop your thoughts in the comments. I want to hear it. Like the video if you want more of this, and I will see you in the next.